Hi, this is Rose Sumaya, and this is a presentation on student disabilities and learning through differentiated instruction and universal design for learning. So here we have listed the 13 disabilities as defined by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We're going to go into more depth about what each one of them means as we go on with the presentation. So the universal design for learning is a, a way of learning that, or a way of teaching that is designed to include all students. So you may be designing your classroom for someone with a physical disability, but you are also in turn helping someone without a physical disability, such as the example of having a door that opens automatically. That's good for someone who is in a wheelchair, but it's also good for someone who might be carrying a lot of stuff. So using this is a way to include every student. And some of the guidelines for universal design for learning are representation, which basically means that the knowing what the people or the students need in your classroom and having that base knowledge for understanding how to help your students, and then taking that and putting it into action, making goals, and from there having engagement that helps all the students learn, that makes them motivated to want to pursue the actions and goals that you have put in place. So the concept of differentiated instruction refers to varying your instruction based on the student's needs. And it also may not be just the instruction, but also the way of assessing a student and trying to understand and make activities that will help your students learn in a variety of ways. Some of the ways that you can use differentiated instruction, especially when you're assessing on how to help your students, is understanding the readiness of your student based on the subject, because you're going to have students who come to the table with a lot of knowledge about a subject, and you're going to have other students who come to the table with perhaps no knowledge about the subject. So taking note of that and proceeding appropriately, understanding what interests your student and keeps them curious and engaged is a huge part of having a classroom that functions well and keeps your students going and motivated. And then having a learning profile just means understanding the type of learner your students are. So, knowing that so and so is a visual learner, this other person likes to learn by moving around, and that sort of thing, and just taking into account where they come from, the culture, gender, even the disability that they may have. So we're going to just go through each disability that's defined by IDEA. And so we're starting with specific learning disabilities, which can include dyslexia and auditory processing disorder. Um, Things like this can really make it hard for a student to process information, which can affect their academics and the cognitive and intellectual abilities. Also academically, when you're struggling to read and write, it makes it hard to achieve things that you may otherwise be capable of. Socially, your peers um, may not be able to engage with you in the same way because of problems communicating through speech or just relaying a story. So for you, universal design for learning, using assistive technology is a great way to help students in all ways, but like for a student who has dyslexia, using a speech to text type thing to write a paper would be very helpful, and that would be helpful to other students too, who may not excel at writing. Differentiated instruction, just understanding that what your students' disabilities are and researching that and coming into the classroom ahead of time with that awareness. Um, and also like getting your students' interest so you can apply that to keep them engaged, and breaking your students down into groups can be helpful so that way they feel more secure. So speech or language disabilities, speech just refers to difficulties in producing sounds and stuttering, adding sounds and whatnot. With language disorder, having difficulty understanding, formulating ideas is the disability there. And so, of course, when you apply that to cognitive and intellectual effects, it affects that by you can't process other people's words, which in turn affects your academics because you have trouble understanding your teacher and contributing to class discussions, which then affects your social abilities because you're not contributing to class discussions, or perhaps even the student will feel embarrassed, unfortunately. So for speech and language disabilities and universal design for learning, I think that charts can help students a lot. And not only do they help, the visual cues help students with language and speech disabilities, but that also helps your students who are visual learners. Giving students extra time is always a great way to help any disability in the classroom. And then for differentiated instruction, um, you know, talking with the student one-on-one, that gives them plenty of time to process and talk back to you so you can gauge where they're at. So for visual impairment, which it can mean two things basically. It can mean low vision, where the student's vision is not corrected with glasses or contacts. So they may be able to see some, but there's definitely difficulties there. And then there is blindness, which literally means there's no eyesight. So one of the ways that this affects cognitive and intellectual and also academic situations is that a student does not necessarily learn the incidental information that you just pick up, like your visual cues in the classroom, even being able to understand body language. And then the social effect, feeling left out with your peers, not, maybe having the same cultural touchstones through television and video games. So to apply universal design for learning and visual impairment, you can use audio instruction that is available after class for students, and that can help not only visually impaired students, but also students who might need extra time or learn better through audio. Differentiated instruction wise, providing large print materials, making your projects more hands-on and engaging different senses rather than eyesight can help a student feel like they're participating in the same way the other students are. With hearing impaired and deafness, there are two definitions. With deafness, that means that the student cannot process any auditory information, and that means with or without the use of hearing aids. When a student is hard of hearing, it means that hearing aids or amplification can benefit them. And they can also communicate back through speech. The way cognitive and intellectual is affected is by language development and the delay in speech. Gosh. So some of the universal design for learning and differentiated instruction are pretty obvious, but my favorite is using expressive hands and face to help students understand concepts, because I have a friend who's hard of hearing, and I really noticed that he uses his hands and face to convey concepts and he really likes to communicate using gifs rather than just words, which is kind of interesting. Um, and then just, just once again, just understanding your students, and even just understanding that sign language is like its own language, so to take that into account. So with deaf blindness, it refers to having both a disability with hearing and a disability with seeing, and it's combined together. The It affects students because of the lack of being able to perceive auditory and visual cues, which can just be so nuanced in the environment, you may not even realize how much you're teaching that way. And then also that can affect how the student is communicating. But the cool thing is that with sign language, a student can potentially communicate still. So some of my favorite ways to apply universal design for learning to deaf blindness is keeping the lighting good, which is something I think may not consider, and then also using touch cues, which I think is good for not just deaf blindness disability, but other disabilities. But just remembering that to engage all your senses if possible. Um, Another and differentiated instruction is have your students write in journals. To get across their ideas, and then just ask your student, how do they prefer to communicate? So orthopedic impairment basically refers to physical disability, and that can come in a lot of shapes and forms. Sometimes the physical disability is accompanied by an intellectual disability. Like 50% of students who have cerebral palsy are also intellectually disabled. One of the most interesting parts I found about social effects is the fact that students might have to have different type of transportation, which takes them out of the classroom and away from their peers more often than other students. So for universal design for learning, one of the biggest things is just making sure that your classroom is physically accessible for your students. Um, And then you can use other assistive technology like voice to text and using keyboards to help students who need that. And then with differentiated instruction, allowing your students to decide where they sit, so that way they're comfortable and feel secure in their surroundings, and you can understand what kind of desk they need. And then uh, allowing your students once again to respond in their preferred way of communicating. Intellectual disabilities, they can limit your mental ability and ability to function on a daily basis. It can affect your social skills, even though a student can have a rich social life, but mostly it just slows down learning. The student may have a below average IQ, or just may learn at a slower pace, but there's still the ability to succeed and gain knowledge. For universal design for learning with intellectual disabilities, making sure that the instructions are available and clear is so important, and also keeping the lessons very structured helps students to understand what's going on and the consistency that that brings. With differentiated instruction, having your students group up for peer tutoring is helpful. And then also just to use the ongoing assessment tool to keep gauging your students' progress instead of making them take tests and that sort of thing is helpful. With a traumatic brain injury, basically that means that a disability is acquired, that something happened to the student. It's not like something that's genetic. It can affect speech, it can affect the student's IQ, but generally there might be a drop in the academic performance, but then it will correct and kind of figure itself out there after the injury has been there for a while. So socially, the student just may feel frustrated trying to understand how things were before the injury and after the injury. So just like with intellectual disabilities on traumatic brain injuries, using in differentiated instruction, using the ongoing assessment is an invaluable tool because your student might be changing it all the time from day to day. Uh, and then for universal design for learning, just keeping those visual aids available so the student can keep them in mind, and then allowing your student to socialize and to keep their relationships built up and kind of understand how to behave if that is a problem. Autism spectrum disorder can really look a lot of different ways, and it combined 5 different syndromes together back in 2013. But basically, there's atypical language development. Some students are, a quarter of the children with autism are nonverbal. That can lead to feeling excluded, even though the student might excel in some areas of the classroom. They may not others. And then just kind of perceiving social interactions is I think one of the trademark ways of looking at autism. So ways to incorporate universal design for learning and differentiated instruction is just observing how a student likes to learn, personalizing the student's work to keep them engaged, and then just not basing your assessments on participation because the student, as previously said, might uh, not be able to socially interact as well as other students. So with emotional disturbance, that can include things like anxiety disorders, mood disorders, oppositional defiant disorders, schizophrenia. Basically, there's internalizing behaviors, there's externalizing behaviors, just looking for that and knowing what those look like. Understanding that the temperament is biological and environmental, and socially, students really can struggle with maintaining relationships or building relationships because of the emotional disturbance. One of the biggest things about this is that students who are uh, defined as emotional disturbance have a 52% dropout rate, and there is a very large discrepancy in diagnosing students who are Black males as emotional disturbance disability over other students. So that's something to take into consideration. So ways to incorporate universal design for learning and differentiated instruction is just to allow extra time between transitions in lessons, and allowing your students to decide how, if they would rather work individually or grouped up at that time, just kind of, trying to be sensitive to different moods. Other health impairments include a lot of different types of things, but a huge one is the ADHD. Um, but basically, mostly other health impairments just really means that there's lower alertness, there's potentially lower strength, lower vitality. That can affect a student's ability to work quickly in class. It can make it difficult to be at school all the time. They might have to be out if there's like something going on like pneumonia, or if they have to be hospitalized with epilepsy and that sort of thing. For universal design for learning, recording your lessons so that way if the student is out of the classroom, they can have access to that is really important. As far as differentiated instruction goes, grading for the knowledge of the core concepts instead of just completing the exact task. That way, if the student's out of the classroom or is unable to organize their thoughts in a way that they need to, they just have a little bit more flexibility. So multiple disabilities, that basically just means that there is a combination of disabilities going on, and a lot of times that means there are severe disabilities that affect not only uh, physical disabilities, but also the intellectual disabilities. There's can be problems communicating, and the student might spend more time out of the classroom. Um, and academically, it just may be difficult to understand uh, where the student is at in regards to academics. So for the universal design for learning and differentiated instruction, allowing like peer tutoring is helpful because it just gives everyone the opportunity to interact and pass on information that way. Using tactile experiences, and then I think one that's kind of cool that would help students in all ways is integrating self-care skills into your lessons. So, not just students with disabilities aren't the ones that need to know how to take care of themselves. Your average student needs to know that as well. So that way everyone can feel included. So the key takeaways are that by incorporating universal design for learning and differentiated learning into the classroom, you can, you know, basically there's a lot of concepts that apply to all disabilities. So just being aware of what your students are bringing to the table and doing your research and being open to helping and learning yourself are really important, and that way you can be the best teacher you can to students with disabilities, and hopefully they'll have a great experience and a good takeaway from your class.